Today's lesson is about slavery in antebellum United States. Antebellum simply means before the Civil War. So we are talking about slavery in the United States before the Civil War. Please take out a sheet of paper, and I would like for you to create a KWL chart. And in the first column, I want you to brainstorm for 1 full minute about all the things that you think you know about slavery in the United States. When you're done with that, I want you to take a few seconds to write down things that you want to know about slavery in the United States. And then at the end of this lesson, or as a way to review the lesson tomorrow, write down the things that you learned about slavery in the United States. I have a slide with the words to know and to help you understand some of the more difficult words in this lesson. In antebellum means occurring or existing before the Civil War. Abolish means to do away with something. And then some of the other ones, if you are not sure what they mean, you can come back to this. Slavery and the Charters of Freedom. In 1776, America's founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, stating that all men are created equal. But at that time, there were about 500,000 enslaved African Americans in the colonies. Almost 1 in 6 people in the colonies lived in bondage. Bondage is another term for enslavement. In addition to the Declaration of Independence in 1787, the preamble to the U.S. Constitution states that we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Liberty means freedom, and if we have slavery in the colonies and in the new country, liberty or freedom cannot exist. Then in 1791, when they added the Bill of Rights, it states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. These things contradict the slavery that was happening in the United States. Let's take a look at these drawings of slave cargo ships in 1788. And so here you can see a cross section or like a dissection of a slave ship drawing. Take a second to look at these photos. Each of these marks that you see on the slave ship represent the amount of cargo that the slave traders thought that they could fit in their ships. So they were trying to estimate how many slaves they could actually fit in the cargo hold of their ships. The first enslaved people were brought to the New World in the 1500s, mostly to South America and the Caribbean. When Europeans first colonized the North American continent, the land was vast and work was harsh, and there was a severe shortage of labor. White bond servants had to pay their passage across the Atlantic Ocean through indentured servitude, meaning they had to work to pay off their debt. These white bond servants did not solve the labor shortage problem. For the next 400 years, over 10 million more were captured in Africa and brought by force across the Atlantic Ocean. About 500,000 of these enslaved Africans were sold in what is now the United States. Slaves were packed into dirty, crowded ships and carried like cargo. They were chained together and given little food or water. This dreadful journey took about 4 months. Many slaves died of disease and starvation. This African slave trade was banned in 1808, meaning companies could no longer bring new slaves to the Americas, North and South, but slavery continued in the United States. In 1619, the first African slaves arrive in Virginia. 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in the Americas. In 1641, Massachusetts is the first colony to legalize slavery. By 1775, the slave population in the American colonies is nearly 500,000. In South Carolina, there are 2 slaves for every free colonist. In the American colonies, slaves were sold at slave markets. Slave traders were looking for the healthiest, strongest slaves, and many families were broken apart. Husbands and wives were separated, children taken from their mothers. Each time a slave was sold, he or she became the property of the owner. And as property, slaves could be bought, sold, and traded. Slaves had no rights. They could not own property, travel without a pass, or even legally marry. If they had children, they too became the master's property. It was also against the law for slaves to learn to read or write, although some did learn discreetly. And these are 2 primary sources showing from the slave trade. And these sources are actually can be found in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Some slaves worked in cities, others on small farms. About half the slaves in the South worked on large farms called plantations, and that's also one of the vocabulary terms. Through the hard work of slaves, many plantation owners became very wealthy, growing crops like tobacco, rice, and sugar. The largest crop in the South was cotton. This system of forced labor helped fuel the growth of the United States into one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And this is a painting done by William Aiken Walker, and it's of a Mississippi plantation. Cotton plantations. On these large cotton plantations, many slaves, and other plantations as well, many slaves did back-breaking work in fields, planting and harvesting crops. Some worked in kitchens and homes as maids, cooks, and weavers, and others used their skills as craftsmen, working as carpenters or blacksmiths. So it was the slave labor that helped to build the plantations, yet the plantation owner or master was the one that was gaining all the wealth. Slaves on plantations usually lived together in small cabins. They were often given little to eat and forced to work from sunup to sundown, even if they were sick. And here is some slave quarters on Carolina plantations. These slave quarters look like some of the ones that you would find in Georgia. And then this is from a history museum showing the inside quarters of some of the slaves. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can also see where the slaves lived on George Washington's plantation in Mount Vernon. Slaves could be treated cruelly by their owners. Some of them were chained so they wouldn't run away. Some of them were whipped. Another word for being whipped is being flogged or flogging. You could get flogged or whipped for breaking any rules, showing up late, or not working hard enough. Sometimes the worst punishment of all was to be sold to another plantation, far away from your family and loved ones. Being sold was a constant fear among slaves, since it could happen when their owners died or if their owners needed more money. By the early 1800s, slavery was abolished or to do away with in the North, but it continued to flourish in the South, where large plantations relied on the free slave labor. By 1860, almost 4 million enslaved African Americans lived in the South. Even though only 25% of white Southerners owned slaves, Most Southerners supported slavery because it was so important to their economy and their way of life. If you take a look at this slide here, this is a map of the United States in 1804. So we had purchased this territory in 1803. And so the pink area represents the actual states. And then anything that is orange is considered territories of the United States. So by 1804, these are the states. In 1834, Canada outlawed slavery. And then in the United States in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. And so with that, even if northern states were against slavery, this law made it so that they had to return slaves that they knew were runaways to their masters in the South. Throughout the 1800s, the North and South would have many conflicts over slavery. As our nation expanded west, there were major debates over whether new states would allow slavery. We will be learning about these conflicts and how they led to the Civil War. I want to point out that this picture is to replicating an actual slaves that were smuggled into the United States. So this is after the law saying that no more slaves could be brought into the United States. This was in Key West, Florida. And this was on April 30th, 1860, just under a year before the start of the Civil War. All right, the next thing that you are going to do is you are going to go in and read the reading in Schoology, Slavery, No Freedom, No Rights. When you get to the top of the second page, after you've read about freedom and equality, if you're able to, using Kami, or underline the phrases that don't make sense for a country that has slavery. If you're unable to do the underlining, just make a mental note of them. When you're finished with the reading, you're going to complete the assessment piece titled Slavery, No Freedom, No Rights. And then there's some questions taken from an excerpt, some questions that you're going to answer about the excerpts taken from an autobiography of a man named Henry Bibb. When you are finished, I want you to think about the things that you learned today and complete the L in your KWL chart.